The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Georgetown law professor Peter Edelman on his new book about the criminalization of poverty in America. Author and Harvard political scientist Danielle Allen tells a tragic story of how the war on drugs is failing our nation's young people. And Bill Press talks with journalist Emma Roller about a radical idea to reform America's prisons. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Peter Edelman is a law professor at Georgetown University Law Center. He served as an assistant secretary at the Department of Health and Human Services in the Clinton administration. In 1996, he resigned because he opposed a welfare reform bill signed by President Clinton. His latest book is Not a Crime to Be Poor: The Criminalization of Poverty in America. And we say hello to Peter Edelman, professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University, where he teaches constitutional law and poverty law and is faculty director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. His latest book, Not a Crime to Be Poor: The Criminalization of Poverty in America. Peter Edelman, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Well, you're welcome. I'm delighted to be with you.
And our pleasure to have you with us as well. You know, most people understand that there is far too much poverty in the United States, but you raised the issue that many poor people live under the threat of going to jail for no other reason than for being poor. That, to me, and you're the lawyer, sounds unconstitutional.
Well, yes and no. It is unconstitutional if there is a fine for doing something, usually something minor, sometimes something that really shouldn't be a violation or a crime at all. And if it's just a fine and the person can't pay it and they put the person in jail, that is unconstitutional. There's a Supreme Court case. The reason I said kind of yes or no is because there are other ways that courts can do it where it's mean and it's terrible, but it's not unconstitutional. If, for example, instead of putting the person in jail for being unable to pay the fine, they give the person, quote unquote, probation, which in fact is not probation at all. It's just a way to squeeze the person for more money. And then what happens is they can't pay on the payment, keep up with the payment plan. They're arrested on a bench warrant, and they're brought in on criminal contempt, which technically and effectively is a new crime. They owe more money, and it hasn't been unconstitutional. So the real answer to all of this is not so much in the Constitution, although some aspects of it, it is unconstitutional. Secondly, in that regard, the states all over just shockingly, they charge money to have a public defender. I mean, that makes people kind of sit up in their chair. And there is a Supreme Court case on that, which is really not being obeyed in state after state. So that is something that's widely done that is unconstitutional.
And you document in your book examples of the court system extracting or perhaps extorting money from people too poor to pay a fine on the spot or to come up with bail money. But how widespread is this state of affairs?
Very widespread. And I should have said, because it comes up also, in fact, it's a major part of all of this, is about, you mentioned, money bail. And this applies to people who are, arrested for anything, and of course sometimes if it's serious, then they shouldn't get bail. But very often on these very small things, they're held in jail waiting for a trial, and they're told that they have to pay $500, $1,000 that they don't have. And the result of it is that they end up pleading guilty on something they did not do, and that gets them into the same terrible situation of the payment plans that go on and added to. So there's a serious question about money bail as between the poor and the not poor. Which is in fact being litigated in cases in courts around the country, and there's been a major decision in Houston, Texas, Harris County, where the federal court down there said that their system, and this would apply really to any place in the country if it were made a national decision. In other words, the problem is there all over the country. That judge down there declared it unconstitutional, that difference between the poor and everyone else. Now, you asked me about national. It's everywhere. All of the things that we've said so far. It's not every county in the country, but you find people doing these kinds of things, back to the fines and fees, very surprisingly in places like Benton County, state of Washington. You know, who would think that? And of course, the question about money bail is even more omnipresent. So these are national problems.
Now, another outrage is that some people, unable to come up with the excessive fines, end up pleading guilty just to avoid jail. But how does that affect them for the rest of their lives?
Because, two ways. One is that once they have, remember these are hefty fines, and they are jacked up much higher than we have, remembering in our own childhood. I used to go up to northern Minnesota with my father and mother, and we talked about a place called Hill City where there was a speed trap. And so if you went 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, you would have to pay, but it might be $50 or $25. And now it's in the hundreds of dollars. So in Oklahoma, for example, the amount is $715.50 for the first DUI, the first just misdemeanor DUI. And that includes these various fees. Oklahoma has 15 different fees that they can, like the law library or something else. So the person starts out owing hundreds of dollars that he or she can't pay, sometimes over $1,000. Then the reason why it goes on is because they can't pay the payment plan, and they get arrested again if they have been late on the payment, and that they add up another violation, and as I mentioned, criminal debt. The other thing, this brings up driver's license suspensions, because this is actually the bigger instance, the bigger situation than the other fines and fees, which might be some crazy thing that they've made up about you haven't mowed your lawn, or you drank a beer can on your own porch, and so you had an open can there, and that's a violation or a misdemeanor. But the license suspensions is really over half of these things around the country, and it's astonishing. In the state of California, 4 million people lost their driver's license suspensions. And what this is all about, everything that we're talking about, is raising money, raising revenue to run the state or the city or the county, whatever level of government that it is. And it's so big, it's over 1 million people in Texas, in North Carolina, nearly that in Virginia and Florida, and on and on. And there, you're almost inevitably going to get stuck because people need to use their cars. And so they take the risk. They have to get to work. They have to do taking their child to doctor's appointment, etc., and they get arrested again. So that's even sort of easier to understand because it's sort of built in from the beginning that they're going to get arrested again and they're going to owe more money. And so I have one example of a man in Los Angeles who was an over-the-highway, over-the-road trucker, and he lost his suspension, $5,000 he owed the government, and he of course couldn't pay, and he lost his job because he didn't have his license. His marriage broke up. He was homeless. And that story got to be better because the legislature finally began to scale down what it was doing, and he ultimately, there was an amnesty, and he finally got his license back and he got his job back. But that's what can happen.
A horrible cycle on the backs of people that can't afford it, and it's nearly impossible to get out of a rut like that.
That is right.
Yeah, we're speaking with Peter Edelman, professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University. His latest book, Not a Crime to be Poor, The Criminalization of Poverty in America. Peter, did this situation come about slowly over time because nobody was paying attention, or is this a direct result of political decisions aimed at minorities and the poor?
Aimed. Well, yes, I guess I would say. I mean, first, why do we have it? It goes back to the anti-tax rebellion. We could say if we were going to use two words, it would be Grover Norquist, who really pushed the fact that all levels of government were going to be squeezed. And what happened, so we're talking late 80s and into the 90s that this jacking up everything started. And so they just turned it on with a vengeance. Now, then the next question comes: why do they go after the poor people? That's where, and they are disproportionately African American, or depending on the part of the country, also Latino. And that seems to be the mean part. Because if they want to get you and me and take more money out of us, it's sort of not fair, but we can pay it. Now, what happens is, though, that they have kind of figured out that they can squeeze these people, get more money this way, because some people won't be able to pay, and that either they'll be put in jail or it'll be just like Mr. Jefferson in Los Angeles actually become homeless. But many, many times, over and over again, what happens is that the family does find the money, but the way they do it is they don't pay the rent, they sell their plasma, they do all kinds of things that are just horrible in order to scrape up the money to pay. And I think that the authorities know that in their mind it's worth doing to squeeze those people as well. Now, I have to say, when one sees, as I have directly myself and through other lawyers the limited number of lawyers who are available to do this, in these municipal courts, more often in smaller places, the ways that the judge treat people could only be described as being racist.
Mm-hmm. Well, and obviously, as we've talked about, you've documented many examples of people being jailed for not being able to pay fines. But how do you respond to that old saying, and it's out there, if you don't do the time or pay the fine, don't do the crime?
Well, a couple things. I mean, one is a lot of these things it's ridiculous to call them crimes. They're things that are just created. That they make them up. The authorities make them up. So that's hardly something that old adage even applies. Secondly, and the harder point here, we need to clean out. We need to simplify. We need to get rid of all these dopey things that shouldn't be crimes at all, or some of them that are misdemeanors should be violations, and they should get a ticket for it at a level of a fine that is rational. That said, to sort of be quote unfair, fair about it, there's certain kinds of things that we need to have that are on the low end for public safety purposes. And then when people can't pay, we need to think about what we can do about it. And various courts around the country are confronting that in an honest way. And they have payment plans with very small amounts of money to pay over a period of time. And it's still tough, but it's an amount of money that can be managed. And secondly, in appropriate cases, they can use community service. But we have to be careful about it because we should only have these things made as crimes or violations that are the right ones to have with the appropriate kinds of penalties for them. And then be careful in the way we administer them.
Okay, and before we let you go, what is the state of poverty and hunger in America as compared to the 1960s when the war on poverty began?
Actually, where we are in poverty as a whole in the country is not that much worse. And I'm talking nationally. When the lowest amount of poverty was in 1973, 11.1% lowest since we were measuring, and then it went. The next lowest was 11.3% when President Clinton left. And now, after the Great Recession, it's come back down to about 13.3%. So that's a difference because every one percentage point is 3 million people. But there are parts of the country, as we know, whether it's the inner city, whether it's rural areas, whether it's Indian reservations, we have terrible poverty in some parts of the country. Now, the fact is that we've had a 40-year continuing problem of not enough good jobs, too many people with low-wage jobs, including people who are working and still in poverty. And we haven't confronted that enough. But on the other side of the coin, we've done things with Social Security, with food stamps, with the Earned Income Tax Credit, so on, a number of different things. And with the public benefits we have, we would have twice as many people who are poor, close to 90 million people instead of the 43 million that we have right now. So we have done the right thing, but we've been up against having this change in the structure of our economy, and that is really what's pulling us down, along with continuing racial discrimination and other factors.
So a lot of work to do. The name of the book, Not a Crime to Be Poor, The Criminalization of Poverty in America. The author, Peter Edelman, professor of law and public policy at Georgetown University, and our guest today on americasdemocrats.org. Peter, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back again soon.
You're very welcome.
And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Danielle Allen, a political theorist at Harvard University, has written a very personal account on the war on drugs and mass incarceration in America. We'll talk to her about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
We've had a great relationship, exalted a giddy Donald Trump following his 2-day schmooze fest in Manila with the thuggish Philippine president Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte, who calls himself a toughie, brags that he's personally killed many people and likes to compare himself to Satan. He's been on a murderous rampage since his election last year. In the name of eliminating the drug trade, he's unleashed a massive military assault across the country, not merely targeting dealers, but also people using drugs. His onslaught is a human rights atrocity, with untold thousands essentially being executed in what are antiseptically termed extrajudicial killings, i.e., illegal, unjustified, murderous. Yet, the present president of the United States says Duterte is his new buddy, and Trump stressed in their official discussions that the Philippine president can count on him and the U.S., which includes you and me, to be a friend. And as a friend, Trump didn't bother his authoritarian buddy with any unpleasant talk about those rampant human rights abuses. Instead, the Duterte-Trump get-together was one of mutual praise and even affection. Indeed, Donald was delighted when Rodrigo impulsively grabbed the microphone at a gala state dinner and serenaded Trump with a love ballad, crooning, "You are the love I've been waiting for." In fact, Duterte had earlier demonstrated that love when he named Jose Antonio to be his trade representative to our country. Antonio, a Philippine real estate mogul, happens to be a partner with our president in the luxurious new Trump Tower, now under construction in Manila. Cozy, huh? This is Jim Hightower saying hugging up the Manila Satan might be good business for Trump, but it's a sorry deal for our national interest, and it's an insult to our people's support of human rights.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Danielle Allen is the director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. She was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 2001. In her most recent book, Cuz, The Life and Times of Michael A., she tells the story of her cousin, a young man who was tried as an adult at age 15 for attempted carjacking. After 13 years in prison, he was released and died violently at the age of 29. It is a story, she says, about a failed war on drugs that has given up on our nation's youth. And we say hello to Danielle Allen, Harvard professor and MacArthur Foundation genius, who has published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. She's also the author of a new book, "'Cause: The Life and Times of Michael A." Danielle Allen, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Glad to be here.
Our pleasure to have you with us. The story of your cousin Michael is about how a young man became a victim of the criminal justice system at a young age and wound up murdered despite everything you did to help. What is the lesson to be drawn?
Well, there are really three areas of responsibility here. Michael made bad choices. My family and I were not equipped as we should have been to help him. And the situation in Los Angeles in the late 80s and early 90s, driven by the war on drugs, gave young people like Michael impossible sets of circumstances to deal with. So the lesson is that we really need to build an opportunity structure for young people that gives them a meaningful chance. We need to equip families to help young people when they get into trouble. We need to reform juvenile justice so that when young people make mistakes, they have a meaningful chance at a second opportunity.
So there are political and policy choices that can be made to save young men like Michael. Are we close to any of them now? What should they be, and how do we get to them?
Well, the first and most important thing that we need to do is end the war on drugs. And by that, I mean legalize marijuana nationally and decriminalize harder drugs. Decriminalizing means to convert simple use and possession of harder drugs, even from felonies to misdemeanors. You still direct the apparatus of the justice system at high-level traffickers, but you treat the basic problem of use and possession of drugs as a matter of a health issue. And so it's a matter of switching the whole way we think about drug control from a criminal justice paradigm to a health paradigm. This has benefits not only for people suffering from addiction, but for the problem of a black market economy and all of the violence that it brings with it. So I really believe that the war on drugs has massively distorted the kind of world that young people come up in, especially in cities. And if we want to give young people a fair shot, we really need to end this version of prohibition.
You know, and I would contend that there are probably more people today that would be in 100% agreement with that than there were, of course, when the war on drugs began. But
I think that's right. I think it's about 63% of Americans agree that we should legalize at least marijuana.
Yeah, but how do we get Congress, how do we get our government to actually act on that? Because it just seems, even with those numbers in front of you, it still feels like we're a long way away of getting there.
Well, the first thing is to recognize that this is really a state issue rather than a federal issue. It's true that the federal policy matters, but at the end of the day, the far vaster portion of our criminal justice system is built at the state level. The good news is there have been movements for reform at the state level. California has legalized marijuana. They have softened the 3 strikes you're outlaw. There has been other reform around juvenile justice. There's even been bipartisan reform efforts in Texas. Massachusetts took a little step towards legalizing marijuana in the last election. So I think what we really need to do is focus on state-level legislative decisions around criminal justice and do everything that we can to maximize reform at the state level.
And you mentioned the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. And was that the root of Michael's problem in his home state of California?
Well, Michael's problems had several dimensions. The first problem is that his mother married somebody who was physically abusive, and that really blew the family to bits and meant that Michael had 5 mid-year school transitions, the last of which put him in South Central Los Angeles in the early 1990s as a kid coming into the city without a pre-existing social network and so forth. So there was that instability that came from abuse inside the family. That's sort of the first issue, and one just has to be very straightforward about that. But then there's the question of where Michael landed in South Central in the early 90s, and there are 2 things that mattered. One is that the war on drugs had accelerated what I call basically a war between the legal state, the state of California, and the parastate. This is the structure of rules and so forth that organize the relationship between cartels supplying drugs, street gangs distributing drugs, and so forth, and the effort of gangs to recruit young people into their world and to maintain control over them. So, as the state ratcheted up its penalties in response, the world of gangs also ratcheted up its system of sanctions and so forth on young people, and meant that especially for kids of 10 to 14, there's a sort of this dangerous world of violence. They need protection in it. The only people offering them protection are gangs. And once they start flirting with gangs, they're stuck. They're caught in that, and then they're into the criminal justice system. So you have that problem. And then on top of it, the increasing penality of the culture and context of California where people reasonably wanted to put an end to violent crime, an end to carjacking and so forth. But the way they did that was by really taking aim at younger and younger people and giving up on a whole generation of teenagers who really needed rehabilitation rather than the most severe and lengthy sentences that they actually got.
We're speaking with Danielle Allen, Harvard professor, who's been published broadly in democratic theory, political sociology, history of political thought. And her new book is "'Cause: The Life and Times of Michael A." Danielle, obviously there are many reasons that young black men may get caught up in crime and prison life. To what extent is it a case of institutional racism? And to what extent is it due to poor personal choices? Because quite frankly, a lot of young white kids make a lot of poor personal choices too.
So I think a degree of difficulty concept can help us understand the situation facing young people in this country, that young people who grow up in different neighborhoods face different degrees of difficulty. If you grow up in an urban city center with violence around you, yes, you can make it out, but you do so by mastering a degree of difficulty that is far higher than a degree of difficulty that faces a young kid coming up in the suburbs. The fact of it is that adolescents across the board, 15-year-olds across the board, are experimenting. They're boundary breakers. They're exploring their identities and so forth. And the consequences of what are sort of just ordinary activities or ordinary forms of exploration for 15-year-olds can be very different in one place than in another. So the truth of the matter is I don't use the vocabulary of institutional racism in my book. I think, there's a lot about the story of criminal justice that is about institutional racism and in its origins. That's where it is. But we have a bigger problem than that, I believe, in the sense of just sort of the spread of penality, the spread of criminalization throughout our society, producing excessive orientation towards punishment, excessive pulling people into the penal system. And if you look now at the situation for criminal justice, I mean, it affects everybody. It's not limited to a specific race. When I first gave these lectures about this book, the thing that most surprised me was the number of people who came up to me after the lectures and said, I've got a family member in prison too, and I've never told anybody. And most of the people who came up to me and said that were white people. So our huge incarceration system, the biggest the world has ever seen, truly affects everybody. And we need to recognize that. It may be that in the first instance, there is an effort to dominate a particular racial group, but the fact of the matter is it spreads to everybody. Domination doesn't really know any bounds, and we have at this point built the biggest prison system the world has ever seen, and we all need to recognize that we're all affected by that and work to undo it. And it sounds to me, too, like a lot of us might just be thinking about this the wrong way. In other words, we're not looking at it the right way to correct the problem. We're kind of going against what we should be doing. You make the point that your cousin, and you alluded to this a little bit, who was a teenage thief but not violent, got caught up in a societal reaction to the wave of carjackings in Los Angeles. On the other side of things, isn't it natural that lawmakers and the general public want to get criminals off the streets? It's absolutely natural that people want to get criminals off the streets, but I need to back up actually, and I would in fact not accept your characterization of my cousin as a teenage thief. So if we're very clear about what he'd done, he stole a jar of coins from a neighbor when he was 10. He stole a radio from a neighbor when he was 13, and he shoplifted once. Okay, so I don't think that adds up to being a teenage thief. I think that is a kid who's in trouble, who is making bad choices, who absolutely, yes, has instincts for theft, but that is not, at that point, a durable pattern of a sort of a life course chosen of theft. So the biggest issue is that at the point when Michael was starting to get in trouble, two things happened. One is that he landed in South Central Los Angeles, where suddenly the stakes were completely different. And the fact of the matter is that the adults in his life could not see that he was starting to flirt with gangs, and they could not see the ways in which gangs were coming into his life and, in some sense, trying to pull him in. That was not visible to adults, and that meant that adults were not able to help him in the way that they needed to help him. And there's a good point, too, because I mischaracterize what Michael was as a kid. And maybe that's part of the problem. There's a breakdown in communication that people are just automatically thinking,
oh, the kid stole stuff, he's a thief. And it's not the case. He's 13, 14, 15 years old. He's a young kid making dumb decisions. So it seems like there's like there's a communication problem, and we do need to think about this differently.
Well, I mean, for me, I think if there's a lesson I would really want people to focus on, it's to pay attention to how we're treating young people between the ages of 10 and 15 when they make bad mistakes. I do not believe that when young people are making bad mistakes at that point in their life, that their course in life is set. I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that they can, in fact, end up on another course. And we have seen cases of alternative approaches to punishment where people are put in highly demanding work programs where they have the chance to develop skills, participate in meaningful work, and so forth, and they make it. They don't return to the bad pattern. And there's a great difference between the results from programs of that kind and what happens when you throw a kid into prison. Michael, went into juvenile at 15, was transferred to adult prison at 17, stayed there until he was 26 on the basis of an attempted carjacking and the robberies that immediately preceded it, which were a spree of violent action that was a phase shift from what we had previously seen with the petty theft. So he did not get that rehabilitative opportunity, which is what he very badly needed. And again, when the young people do get those rehabilitative opportunities, their courses do go in a different direction. Mm-hmm.
To what extent is the issue of young men getting caught up in an economic and legal system that condemns them to failure a part of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, look, let's just think through the numbers here for a moment, okay? So we have to remember there's more than 2 million people in prison in America right now. There are more than 2 million people in prison in America last year, the year before, et cetera. If you think about it, every single one of those people, and that's, black people, it's white people, it's Latino people, it's really everybody, Asian Americans, everybody's represented in that prison population. Every one of those 2 million people is connected to, let's say, 6 to 20 other people, we'll call it, right? So that's, already right there, some, 12 million to 40 million Americans who are directly affected this year by the criminal justice system. And, then when you remember the disproportion of African Americans in the criminal justice system, you'll recognize that the entire African American community has, for the last 2 decades, been massively impacted by the excessive incarceration that this country has developed. So, yes, I'm sure that this is a part of the fuel for the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think that you'll find more broadly, if you, sort of explore opinions throughout the black community, you will see from one person to the next just a profound recognition of the utter tragedy of the loss of a generation that we've experienced over the last 20 years.
Danielle Allen, Harvard professor, published broadly, as I mentioned before, in democratic theory, political sociology, and the history of political thought. Her new book is "'Cause: The Life and Times of Michael A." Danielle, we do appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks for having me, Jim. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with journalist Emma Roller about the prison abolition movement that seeks a more humane response to incarceration.
Here with us in studio from Splinter, senior reporter Emma Roller. Hello, Emma.
Hey, Bill.
Nice to see you. You have written a very interesting article about for Splinter News, splinternews.com, banning prisons.
Yes, so
that's pretty extreme.
So we had an entire theme the week before Thanksgiving of Ban Week, and everyone at Splinter was assigned to pitch different things they'd like to ban. And so I decided to write about the prison abolition movement.
Is there a movement? I didn't know there was.
There is.
There's one movement to make them private, to privatize prisons.
To private or not privatize? Oh, yeah. Well, there is the movement to privatize.
And then not to privatize, but
sure.
to do away with them altogether?
Right. So when you think about the idea of dismantling the prison industrial complex, that sounds pretty extreme off the bat, right? But what prison abolitionists are talking about, people who have much more history and background and activism in this than I do, who I talked to for this piece, it's not the idea of, okay, starting tomorrow, we're going to take a sledgehammer to every prison in the country and set everyone out. It's the idea of building up a different social network or social safety net so that prisons are less necessary in society. What does that mean? That means support for people with drug issues. That means mental health issues. That means just better health care. A lot of people in prison are in prison simply because they cannot afford to pay bail. I think that's something that a lot of people don't know, is that we literally lock people up for being poor in this country. And it's not an insignificant number of people. And that's setting aside, the nonviolent drug offenses. So
right.
I think that's the starting point of...
But there will be a certain number of violent criminals who should be put away, throw away the key, right?
Right. And prison abolitionists take different stances on this. And I don't think anyone's saying, the inevitable question when you bring up prison abolition is, well, what about all the, what about the serial killers?
Right, what about Charlie Manson, who died last week, right?
Right.
What would you have done with him?
Well, he's not alive anymore, for one.
Well, no, because he was in prison
right.
for all of his life.
No, I don't think anyone is saying that we should put other people's safety in jeopardy because of, freedom. It's more about how can we strengthen everyone's liberty and everyone's justice. When you start thinking about violence not as like an A to B line, but as a circle, and it's kind of hard to explain all of this. I get at it in the piece. But, it's easy to think of like, okay, Tommy hit Billy. That's violence. But if, someone gets raped in prison, does that count as violence? If a mother is sent to a federal penitentiary for a nonviolent drug offense and her small children aren't able to visit her, does that count as violence? You have to sort of really take an accounting of what counts as violence in our society and what does not. And prison abolitionists argue that there are different types of violence than just, serial killers.
Yeah. I think they make a strong argument. I've never been involved in this issue, but I think that to think that you're going to do away with prisons entirely is probably just not realistic. Mm-hmm. But on the nonviolent drug offenses, one of the tragedies of this Trump presidency is we were well on our way, I think, in a bipartisan way to get some resolution of sentencing reform, of sentencing and prison reform under as recently as the last year of the Obama administration. Even the Koch brothers were supporting it.
Sure.
And Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump have just dropped it like a hot rock and are going in the exact opposite direction.
Right. I think it's been really interesting, and some may say infuriating, to watch, Republicans positioning on criminal justice reform, 2 years ago versus now.
Yeah.
You had people like Rand Paul, even people like John Cornyn in Texas saying, yes, we are locking way too many people up for nonviolent drug offenses, especially with the opioid epidemic. A lot more, it has to be said, a lot more white politicians are feeling more empathetic because the opioid crisis has hit white rural populations more than, say, the heroin epidemic or crack cocaine, when we started really locking people up with mandatory minimums.
Right. And suddenly that whole movement... That
has evaporated since Trump was elected. And I don't know if it shows that, people like Rand Paul and John Cornyn and the Koch brothers were never actually that serious about criminal justice reform, or if this is just the most politically expedient route to go and have just decided to go along with the Jeff Sessions agenda. I'm not sure what it is.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Peter Edelman, Danielle Allen, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.